Hi, this is Eli Ocheltree of the SnoKing Beekeepers Association, and this is our third Wednesday meeting, which is actually on the fourth Wednesday of the month, but next month we will return to normal. And we are covering winterization. Today is September 22nd, 2021. And as usual, I'll sort of start. I'm going to go through the announcements and ask if there's any questions then, and then start on winterization. And I'm hoping people have ideas to share, what they've tried, what their real questions are. We covered the Varroa mite part of winterization somewhat last time in the last monthly meeting, and we can review any of that that we need to. People are still joining. Okay, but I'll go ahead and start. Let's see. I don't think I actually got slides in this slide deck on the fair, which was really exciting, really fun. And I see people here who were wonderful enough to show up, and we had a great time. And there was another bee club there too, and there was a little bit of confusion about that. If anyone hears that they're not getting an email from us and they signed up to get an email, they signed up at the other bee club, okay? I went to the meeting, the monthly meeting, because I am a member of the other bee club that has a Snohomish address. And while I was there, it came up that they had 86 people sign and up to get information about the club. And we didn't do that. We didn't have a sign-up sheet. So if someone says they signed up, please give them our information, because people who signed up were expecting to get multiple beginner classes and such offered. They were expecting a Facebook discussion page. They were expecting a whole bunch of things. So any of you that can pass the word about our classes, which are starting, actually Monday the 4th, the first one will start. So I'll go through the classes and stuff first. I'm really excited about the online website though. Do tell me, we still have some bugs to work out on it, but the application process through it is working pretty well. And people are starting to apply for beginner and apprentice. I've sent out some notices. I'm just starting the advertising. That may seem kind of last minute, since October 4th, when apprentice starts, is only a week from Monday. But what I have found in the past is people can't really commit more than 2 weeks in advance. They just don't know what their schedule is going to be. So hope it's not pushing it too close. I'll be putting out more notices. Pass the word any way you can on your personal groups or whatever. I think everybody who's here, okay, I think everybody who's here understands that we are a small member bee club that is a member club of the Washington State Beekeepers Association. And mainly that gives us the benefit of offering their classes for certification by them. And that's really the main thing, the main advantage we get from that. The annual conference was canceled this year, so we didn't get that. And we were really looking forward to that because our club is going to have a booth there. So the classes are starting, and that's sort of one of the biggest things about our club is that we're really helping beekeepers. The next beginner class is going to start on Thursdays, and I'm going to alternate the days of the week because it was just too fixed for me to always teach on a Tuesday or a Thursday, or Tuesdays or Thursdays or Mondays or whatever. So we're going to alternate. The next beginner class is going to start on Thursday, October 7th, and go 7 Thursdays in a row. Then after that, when that finishes, I will go to teaching beginner in a Monday, Wednesday, 7 of those consecutively, starting right before Thanksgiving, I think, comes out. But that's sort of the only way to get it in before Christmas. And Christmas is big because a lot of people start buying the equipment and trying to order their bees then and trying to really make plans, which is great. We love seeing you in beginner class now in the fall. Apprentice. There's been so much demand for apprentice. People have been waiting months for apprentice. We're going to start on Monday and do 7 consecutive Mondays, but we will change that to a different day of the week. Not everybody can do the same day of the week. So there will be another one coming up. First, I have to talk to the journeyman because we have to get the next journeyman class going. I hope everyone knows about the Facebook discussion page. If you type in SnoKing Beekeepers on Facebook, it should come up. And then you have to ask to join by clicking on groups. And you can always get a hold of me. The beginning beekeeping course, it's the same. If people know what it was, it's still online. Everything's online. We don't know for how long. We're just settling into online. Zoom. And there'll be 7 90-minute presentations. And I talk like I do tonight, except tonight I'm really going to take a break after the announcements and make sure everybody's caught up on the courses and the dates and times, because I think some people came specifically for that to this meeting to catch up. I'm letting people into the meeting right now. Okay, I already said there's 2 different sessions. They cover the same material. It takes me 10 and a half.
Which one do you want?
I'm on a beat.
I have to mute somebody. Okay, I think I got it. They cover the same material. It takes me 10 and a half hours to get through what I think you need to know to even get a good start on bees. And then I beg you to take apprentice as soon as you've done 1 season's worth of keeping bees, because there's still so much more information.
You gonna leave the meeting?
No, you're gonna leave the meeting.
Oh dear. Somebody's not muted. I'm going to mute somebody. Hang on.
It's me.
Okay, is everybody muted now? And sometimes people have to come phone in. And so when they phone in, it's a different mute. And sometimes they don't realize they need to do that. Steve, are you muted now?
Oh, no.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, we're good now. Back to beginner. It's the usual. There's a printed manual. You also get a digital manual. I can send that to you, but you're entitled to a printed manual. And that's why your address on the application is very important. Your name on the application, I will try to get that name on the certificate. Usually WASBA can do that. So it's important that you fill out that application with your name and your address the way you really want them. I would really love it, and people are doing it online. The Wix, I had to learn Wix. I took a crash course in Wix.
Sorry, you're missing out.
Yeah.
Okay. So we have 1 person not muted. Let me double check here. Okay. I think I got it. I'm losing my focus. Okay, back to name and address need to be right. And then, oh, there's 1 change on the dues. We've never had dues before. Any dues that I ever mentioned before were the WASBA dues. They consider your dues for the year paid when you get your certificate. Kind of odd. So anybody taking a beginner or apprentice course, when you get your certificate, they will consider you paid for the following calendar year. So when I say dues, that people owe $20 for dues, we've had to start charging dues as a club. We didn't do that for the first 2 years. And now we found that between insurance for the hive sides and various fees, for example, for Wix, which was more expensive than I thought it would be, and let me know whatever doesn't work on that Wix website, because I'm the person learning it. A few people are helping, and I hope we're really going to check it and help touch it up. The payment ways are still the same for all the classes. We still have the same PayPal and the donate on Facebook on the business page. The page isn't really for discussion. I call it a splash page. It just says we exist. And there's always snail mail checks for you people who just don't want to do any more giving up your privacy and any more technology. Apprentice. Apprentice is, again, same 7 90-minute presentations. Still in the evening. 6:30 is the best time we found. Journeyman, I will ask because it's a smaller class and people might want to slide the time on that. I need to send that notice out in the next couple of days. Apprentice, same thing. You still owe $20 for dues because any dues in the past were for WASBA. This time it's for our club. Apprentice, one very, very important notice on Apprentice. If you read the journeyman requirements on wasba.org, if you go to the Washington State Beekeepers official site, they made a small change to journeyman and to getting certified for journeyman. We do the academic portion online. They put a little clause in there, just put it in just recently, and I just happened to see it, that service that you do to count toward journeyman is supposed to be done after you've earned the apprentice certificate. Right now, for a lot of you, that doesn't seem very important. You want to hopefully just want to take the apprentice class, not so much for the certificate, but just as the real essential sequel to beginner, because it really is. You just can't cover it all in the first class. You get a hands-on season, even a few months with the bees, and all of a sudden you have a lot of questions. And now you understand a lot of what happened in beginner, but you still need more and you still need to review it. But because of that, the service points, like working at the fair, aren't really supposed to count until you take apprentice and get that certificate. It becomes a little more important to get that certificate now. Also, they added another clause. Well, no, they actually didn't say you had to have 3 years beekeeping after apprentice. It's somewhat implied. So if you are thinking at all, and I would love everyone who keeps bees for 3 years or more to get journeyman, because you will pick up so much knowledge. You'll be able to just feel more confident. You'll get better resources. We'll have better networking, and you can help me help lots of other people too. So I'm hoping that I can push people who are ready to take apprentice. You've had 1 season of beekeeping at least, and take it. Partly though, because I'm hoping to push you through journeyman. If you have taken any course from me, you've gotten a progress form, unless somehow I didn't send it to you. Notify me if I haven't. And on it, you start tracking these things. And it sounds really funny. For a lot of you, you're just not interested in journeyman right now. But there's really no reason not to get it if you are all active in beekeeping and in your club. And on it, I record, and every instructor is supposed to be recording your scores. This is a slightly older version of the form, but this is what it looks like. It's double-sided. I should be sending it out when I send you your certificate. Journeyman service is a little complicated. You have to talk to me about that. And I need to be sending out that email to the journeyman. This is something I wanted to point out that's different about our club. And at the fair, it became obvious to me that people were signing up at the other bee club's booth, and they were thinking they were going to get these benefits. And it's going to get a little confusing, and it does. And we'll just straighten it out on the discussion group or one at a time as we find out. This club does public outreach. Without requiring membership, we have a Facebook discussion group. We have a YouTube channel, and not every video is open to the public, but for example, this recording is. And you are being recorded in this meeting. The newsletter, we are open to the public. Our newsletter is available to anyone. And we do a lot of public outreach. The Evergreen State Fair, we were going to do the return of the salmon, that's been canceled, and the annual conference has been canceled. And we worked really hard at making information and resources available. At the fair, for example, we had all kinds of brochures, we had catalogs, we were telling you where you could get information. We don't just simply send you to one source. And the other club does that. They send you to one bee club. So I want to make sure everybody's getting in. Is everybody in now? Yes, good. And hopefully all the internet links are working. But now with membership, we are going to say you have to pay that $20 annual dues to get access to our beginner and apprentice and journeyman classes, which are all except journeyman are offered year round. Journeyman tends to be once a year unless we get enough people who are interested and we can offer another one. And that especially seems to draw from at least Western Washington, if not Eastern Washington as well. And also the hive sites. We're going to say, well, you got to sign up and our liability insurance will cover you. And for extractor use, we need to think about, we only have one small extractor and we are getting to a size where we need more than one extractor, and more than one location to pick it up from would really be nice. In making information and resources available, we have a whole list of new package suppliers, which needs to get updated soon. All those brochures and catalogs we gave out at the fair, we want to make sure that you don't get told just to buy one Varroa treatment because that's what somebody has on hand at their store. We want you to know what the options are. See last monthly meeting, the last recording on YouTube for that, or talk to me afterwards at the discussion time. And the whole idea of a Facebook discussion group that's open to Western Washington people. We distributed 35 Asian giant hornet traps. We want to make sure people get a chance. Those were free from the Washington State Department of Agriculture. The only thing was getting them out was the important part. And the newsletter gets a lot of information out and helps everybody just network and share and get together. Okay, maybe I should stop quickly and ask if there's any questions. Okay, are there questions? Anybody want to unmute themselves and tell me? And Bethany, yes, I'm recording. She just asked, and yes, and I will answer by email when I get your application through the online, or if you need email me and I'll get you an application. Okay, any questions so far on all the crazy, that's just business. The fair was wonderful. It really was. It was really, everybody who came just said, this is great. This is like the annual picnic, which we need to start thinking about having summertime outdoor get-togethers. Maybe we could swing a month. I would really like to learn how to do hybrid. Any questions, or should I just go into talking about winterization? And I'm hoping that people will share screen with pictures of what they do or don't do on the winterization. Should I go ahead? Okay, I don't see anything more in chat. I'm going to go ahead. This is less formal than a class. So if you need to stop me, unmute yourself and stop me, okay? Fall preparation. We actually start this in August. Beekeepers obsess about preparing for fall, but that's because bees are a cycle. Beekeeping is a cycle. It never seems like it stops. At least gardening, it seems like you mulch the garden and you're done for the winter, but not really. If you're really a really dedicated gardener, you do winter gardening and early spring and all that. In beekeeping, you don't have a choice. You are going to do fall prep, you are going to do winter checks, and you are going to be doing spring duties. There is no snowbirding unless you can get somebody to fill in for you, which is part of sharing and networking, is having somebody to check your hives while you're gone. And for example, right now, if you're leaving and you know your hives don't have enough stores and you want them fed 2-to-1 syrup, this is a good time to make a friend. Introduce yourself. Say, gee, I'm really close to you. I would be happy to return the favor later. So on our yearly cycle, there are people who are still talking about the last of the summer fall flows. Here's the infamous knotweed. I love to put pictures of this up because it's the thing that nobody notices until you become a beekeeper, unless you're a noxious weed board person trying to kill it. But other than that, beekeepers are the ones who know what Japanese knotweed is, and we think it's pretty good stuff because we don't have any other flow that's that good, that strong in most parts of Western Washington. Here's the yearly cycle laid out in a January to December graph. And I just could not resist putting a little "you are here" sign. I just took 2 weeks of vacation and spent a lot of time looking at little "you are here" signs on maps and directories. So this is where we are. Our hives grew up in population. We went through a nectar flow and it was a pretty good one. A lot of people bragged about a lot of honey. That was really great. Even first year people said, yes, yes, we have honey. And then for some of us about here, we're going back in our hives and the bees ate it up. It was a good year. They laid up surplus and then some of them ate it, some of them saved it. And so we are going to talk a lot about feeding and winterizing because the population drops as it needs to for the winter. A quick summary. We talk about winterization. I like to talk about it in 3 stages. And we're doing a lot of scurrying around. There's a lot of discussion going on right now. And I call it the temperature drop. We haven't really totally hit the temperature drop. It looks from my weather report like we're settling into 60s during the day and 50s at night. I consider the big drop to be when we go to like maybe 50 in the days and low 40s at night. It's not freezing, but it gets so bad weather that the bees aren't going in and out every day. We're getting a certain number of days where they're still going in and out because it is above 60 a lot of days, even if it's overcast. But those bees, they can find their way around because they can see where the sun is with their ultraviolet light ability, which is really neat that they can figure out where the sun is on an overcast day. So at this point, I consider this before we go into the barely 50 and low 40s, high 30s, and we just kind of sit there sometimes for a month or 2 in October, November, depending on your area. This is when we start saying, okay, we've got too many boxes on the hive. We need a telescoping lid or a peaked roof. Not that migratory. The migratory lid is the one that doesn't come down on all 4 sides. And it's migratory, called that because commercial beekeepers use it. We start thinking about top insulation if we don't already have it on. It's not a bad thing to have year round, to have insulation right under your telescoping upper lid. We start thinking about liquid feeder under that, which helps keep the liquid feed warm. Maybe we're thinking about strapping or putting that cinder block on top because the winds pick up quite a bit. Some of you already have that. Honey is an insulator, so even sugar syrup honey helps insulate the hive. Mouse guards, before it freezes, before the mice move in, putting this nice little bit of metal that they can't chew through and sneak through. And this is what I consider stage 1. A lot of us are doing it right now and probably should be starting it now. And then it starts to get into freezing or right next to it. By now, people are thinking about raising the back of the hive an inch so that condensation, if it forms on the inner lid or the telescoping lid, will roll from the back of the hive forward, right along the lid if it formed there. And we're probably putting our mite count boards, slide outs, we call them, in. We're taking liquid feed out when it gets that cold because the bees can't access it if it's too cold for the liquid feed to move, to drain through, or for them to get up and access it, whichever way it is. I use gravity feed hole punched in the lid jar system on top. Some people are using more of a tank system or a frame feeder, and we might as well take it out when it just gets too cold. So if we're going to shift from liquid to dry feed, we're going to do that now. And we're going to figure out how we're going to fit that in and some moisture absorbency. Most people seem to be doing moisture absorbency in Western Washington. I think it's good insurance, even if you're not sure you need it. And pollen sub, which is controversial. And there's a winter mix for pollen sub for people who are iffy on doing it. Most people are going to put a small top vent for moisture control in the inner cover or in the moisture absorbency shim box holder. And the last stage is people are going to wrap, and they're really going to reduce the entrances down because the bees don't need it, and it's encouraging robbers and other problems. Okay, I ran through this at lightning speed. Now let's go through it after I quickly mentioned that your job isn't done when you've done all that. You're still going to have to go out there November, December, January. You're going to be clearing entrances. You're going to be checking that slide out door. You're going to be making sure that any feed you put on doesn't end up blocking the airflow through the hive, the ventilation, because you know, especially after your first winter, that a 5-second check could save a hive. If they lost their entrances, if something happened with the feed, something slipped, if their stores got used up too fast, you're going to go out there. When I say clear entrances, you're actually removing dead from the bottom board. And if you can, debris from even in front of the hive. So in the spring, it doesn't attract yellow jackets and predators and such. And of course, you're making notes in your journal at all times. Now, to talk about winterization, one of the first things is to stop and recognize this incredible miracle called the European Western honeybee, Apis mellifera, surviving in northern latitudes. It came out of either Asia or Africa, depending on who you listen to, but definitely from farther south, and can live in our temperate zones and overwinter. It does this with a couple of adaptations, which are incredible. The first one is it lays up surplus stores. Yeah, a lot of animals store a little bit of winter food, but enough food to feed tens of thousands of individuals, that's a lot of food. And feed them for a winter, a temperate winter, which could be 4 or 5 months, stretching into a damp spring. Yeah. And then clustering, they have this ability to cluster. And it's not just a dormancy cluster. They don't go dormant. They are clustering alive, keeping the queen in the center warm. And if they have brood, keeping it warm at incredible temperatures. 68 to 70 degrees for the queen, 92 to 95 degrees for brood when it's being actually reared. Then they have this other adaptation, which you hear people talk about, that the bees, that your young bees now, trying to think, it depends on your area, but should be emerging about now. Those are maybe a few weeks ago, depending on your weather. Those bees are called winter bees and will live longer. Some of them will live for like 5 months. And sometimes they're referred to as fat bees. And I didn't get a picture of fat bodies in here, but if you watch the Samuel Ramsey Varroa Do Not Feed on Hemolymph video that I highly recommend, it's on all my lists of resources, and I talk about it every time I teach Varroa. The winter bees are actually physiologically a little bit different. That's an incredible adaptation too. That actually they're a little different, genetically the same, but physiologically, metabolism-wise, a little bit different. And then we as beekeepers can help those surplus stores, that clustering, and that winter bee phenomenon to happen and happen in the best way possible, and we can encourage and nourish it, those tendencies. Now, I've got this picture here just because right now, did you realize? I think today is the first day officially of fall. For a beekeeper, we've been in fall for a month and a half. I mean, really, we've been thinking about winter all that time. To me, that's fall. But actually, the equinox just passed. Those extra long days that we get because we are in this area. Where are we? About here. Okay. And we got those extra long days, but now the Earth's tilt in relation to the sun is changing. And we're going equal day and night, and then we're going to go all the way to the winter solstice, which is the time when it's really important to look at how much sunlight your bees are getting or not getting, because sun really helps bees, especially at this latitude. Any winter sun they can get is great. But I wanted to point out that it's not hopeless keeping bees up here in our cold, rainy winters, because bees have that long day length to get those surplus stores. We're not in the top 10 states here, but do notice that those top 10 states are all up here in basically our latitude. So our bees have had a chance. They can do it with a little help. The cluster. People talk constantly about the cluster in winter, so I wanted to take a little time just to make sure people have access to whatever they need to think it through on what the cluster is. We know that here's a set of temperatures here. And I know I cover this by Journeyman. I put some slides in here. They're not totally in order because I threw them in from Journeyman. I feel like if we're going to meet for a monthly meeting, let's talk a little more intensely than we would for beginner or even apprentice. I mentioned a couple of these temperatures, this list of temperatures here, the 68, 70 degrees. The queen has to be kept at that, and she also can't fly. That's important for mating purposes. That's why it says that. Bees will try to keep the winter cluster a little higher than that. It says broodless winter cluster, but that's apparently the minimum down here to keep the queen alive. The center of the cluster where she is has to be kept that warm. They'll try to keep it warmer, and once they've got eggs and young larvae, they've got to get up here in the 90s. And if you think Celsius, that's on the left-hand side of the thermometer too. People talk about the cluster forms at 57. I got really confused about this because I know, and you all know, that the bees fly at less than 57 degrees outside. Because if they didn't, they would have a heck of a time surviving in this climate. The winter would turn into a full 9 months. Apparently 57 degrees is the body temperature of a bee that must be maintained. If a bee is moving around actively and flying and foraging, yes, it can fly at a lower temperature, but it needs to put in muscle heat generated by muscle physical activity, or it's helping heat the cluster. Here's an image over on the left of just the idea of the cluster isn't all the same temperature, which makes sense. But inside, if the queen or the brood nest area here, the minimum temperatures are given in that chart. It kind of helps to realize, and this diagram is illustrating that the ambient temperature outside is not very different from the temperature inside the hive. The bees can't heat and don't try to heat the whole hive. That's not their goal in life. Their goal in life is to keep the colony, the superorganism, at a minimum temperature and alive. It's always their goal. And if it helps you visualize this, when we get to talking about you've got to have a certain number of bees, a certain number of bees are going to be able to be more efficient. You might remember this thing about surface area to volume ratio, and it applies to bees just as much as it applies to, I hope people remember this exercise. And if you don't, maybe at the recording, look at this and think about it again. If I have so many bees, I can expend so much energy to keep the inside of that globe of bees, that cluster of bees, warm. It's actually going to be easier if I have more bees because I'm going to have a big volume and the surface area have gone up as much. And that's what they're trying to show you here is SA, surface area to volume ratio. That if you have a little cluster, like this little cube here, you have a big surface area to volume. But if you get big, suddenly there's a lot of heat that you can maintain and hold inside that bigger cluster. Why is that important? Because when you're going into winter, you need to have a big enough cluster. And that is sometimes difficult for beginning beekeepers to stop and think about and visualize. Coming back to that a little bit later. But you saw what 10,000 bees looked like in the spring. If you got a package, and if you got a nuke, you saw, including larvae, about what 10,000 looked like. Especially if it was a deep frame nuke, 5 deep frames. If the bees are packed on them, it's considered to be 2,000 bees to a packed, both sides, deep frame. So a 5-frame deep nuke packed with bees is basically 10,000. Same as a package, 3-pound package is 10,000. Now to go into the winter, you're going to need more than 10,000 because some are going to die during the winter. That's to help you visualize how many you need and if you need to take 2 small colonies or a small and a large colony and merge them. That cluster is not a static concept. It's very dynamic, which also gets confusing when you're listening to people talk about the cluster. It shrinks, it expands, it follows the heat up, it actually moves. I think in our climate, it doesn't simply form, it forms, loosens up and kind of breaks apart. The bees get some time to go get some food, but then temperature falls and the cluster has to shrink back in again. The lowest temperature the colony can survive. In the Canadians can show you, double checking everyone's in. The Canadians can show that at incredibly negative temperatures, their colonies can survive. It depends on the number of bees, the quantity of the stores, and how long it stays how cold. So it's really hard, but it is incredible. Oh, I'm sorry, this slide's out of order. It's actually should be in the feeding section. Okay, those winter bees I mentioned. We talk about mite treating back in August. Many people say you need to be really concerned about it back in July. Why? Because that queen is laying eggs 21 days. She must lay eggs 21 days before the bees stop raising brood. She can't do it too early to get good winter fat bees. She needs to do it early, but not so early that the bees 21 days post-emergent, those bees that she laid the eggs for the bees that are going to live through the winter, they need to not forage. They need to be young bees, basically 21 days or less post-emergence. Foraging is what really ages workers. There's some physiological metabolic changes that happen. You might have heard people talk about vitellogenin and juvenile hormone balance inside of the worker bodies. And part of that is, are they worn out with that final phase of foraging? And winter bees are going to last a lot longer if they haven't been aged by foraging, which they start 21 days post-emergence. And I was going to get a picture from Samuel Ramsey's. They are obviously going to be healthier if they're not fed on Varroa. This goes back to the, if you can, start getting your mite counts down in July, which is hard to even see because there's still a fair amount of cat brood. Because by the time the queen is laying the eggs for the winter fat bees, we need a low mite level so that our poor winter bees don't get fed on like this one in the picture. And there's a lot of stuff that we can do as a beekeeper. Okay, stores, cluster fat bees, and beekeeper management. We, late August and September, and many of you have already worked on this and the others are catching up, right? You're looking at the knotweed flow and saying, okay, can I get those supers off? Can I get all the excess equipment off? How am I doing on the number of bees and the amount of stores? And if I know I don't have double or triple what I bought in the spring, if I don't have that 20,000, if they're young, 20,000 is going to be enough to get you through the winter, but maybe 30,000 bees. Have I got a good queen, or do I need to requeen? Do I need to feed? Because I know those stores aren't good enough. The Varroa, hopefully you've all taken care of. If not, let's get on it right now. Moisture control, taking all the extra off. Some of this is a little out of order. Relocating your hive. Are you happy with where your hive is? If you aren't, and you take off a lot of excess baggage and empty boxes and such, this is actually a good time to move to the place that's going to get the most sun, the best wind protection, etc. This was last month's, the Varroa protection. I want to make sure everybody understood that this is this chart with 9 Varroa treatments that are in common use. It's under files. I'm putting it on the SnoKingBK.org website as well. And it'll be under links and resources. I think I got this on. And then these documents here are still under files. If you are thinking of using a mite treatment and you can't find the instructions, you may be able to find it in this list of ones that you can find under files in our Facebook discussion group. Now, part of the management, protecting your bees as much as you can. I mentioned daylight. One of the things that really helps is if your bees can get out for cleansing flights, and that's easier for them to do if there's a chance that the sun during one of our rare sun breaks during the winter will hit the hive and they get out for cleansing flights. Frequency of cleansing flights cuts down this fecal spotting that some hives get, bee diarrhea, often due to an organism, a microorganism known as nosema. But the more physical threats that you can see more obviously are things like mice, bald-faced hornets, yellow jackets, skunks, bears. And we talk about that in beginner. Any questions or any great ideas on that, let me know. The only one that usually people don't immediately think of is cleaning up the debris and dead bees around your beehive. Also, wasps, yellow jackets, and such can fly at lower temperatures than bees. So your bees are going, it's only 50 out there. I don't really want to go out and forage today. They're inside the hive, and they might pull back somewhat from guarding the entrance. They're not going in and out. But wasps are known to fly at about 10 degrees lower temperature than bees. So when your bees are not actively foraging or using the entrance exit on the beehive, it's really important that you have your entrances reduced, or you've got your robbing screens on, whatever you do, and clean up this debris that might attract yellow jackets. Apparently they're scavengers and as well as being carnivores. Now, everybody worries about overwinter losses. It's not the end of the world if you lose a hive. And you're going to get a lot of advice on why it happened or didn't happen. And you may be, right now, some of you may be saying, what happened last winter? What did I lose them to? Was it the lack of food? Maybe I didn't have enough bees to start with. Was it too much moisture? Did they get wet? By the time you look at a dead out in the spring, it's always wet. In this climate, everything gets wet during the winter. Was it too many mites? Was there a disease I didn't see, maybe carried by the mites? Okay, and you're going to feel like this poor little guy here who's totally confused. I think he describes beekeeping to me. This guy is like quintessential beekeeper. So you're going to do your best with your beekeeping management to assist this wonderful honeybee that already knows how to store. It already knows how to cluster. It knows how to make fat body winter bees. And you're going to help it. Cold alone doesn't kill it. That's the amazing thing. The Western honeybee can handle that. But if it has cold and a weak or small colony, and you have to be honest with yourself, and this is really hard for first-year beekeepers, if it was a late swarm or split, if there was a robbing incident that can drop the population of the hive. If there was too much Varroa, you didn't get to it on time, that can mean the number of healthy bees that can survive the winter is down, even if you do see other bees. It could be cold with you didn't have the food, but that's easy to take care of, feed your bees. And condensation is a little trickier. And all of these topics are ones you get lots of good conversation on. And it's good to have those conversations. And Varroa, we harp on Varroa because it is the biggest thing that seems to make the difference. The surveys that have been done by the researchers say that the September mite count, if you can get it down now, it's your best predictor of winter survival. I was slow getting my mite count down last year, but I got it down by October and my hives made it. So it's not too late, I hope. Your guidelines for stores, how much? I do sometimes hear people say, well, I left all the honey that the bees made on the hives. I didn't take any. If it's a new hive, if they were robbed, if the hive did not cut back the population, if they get fooled by the weather, there's a half dozen things that can happen. And the bees don't have enough stores. You have to check. You can't assume that bees know best and they simply survived. They are still a tropical insect. They still make mistakes and we manage them. So what's recommended in this climate is 2 deeps. There's a lot of buzz about single deeps. Your first year or two, we say don't do it. It's tricky and it's often predicated on commercial beekeepers. And once you hit 10, 20 hives, maybe then you want to talk about it. But when you only have a few hives, are you willing to take the 20, 30, even 40% loss that commercial beekeepers consider fine? They can just split the hives in the spring. That might or might not be okay. But if that 20, 30, 40% is both of the 2 hives you have, that's not really a good system. We're highly recommending 2 deeps or the equivalent of that. I like 3 westerns, 10 frame, half bees, half stores. That's actually going to be pretty heavy. But like, as I said, if you were going to relocate, this is the smallest size an established hive is going to be, really. Maybe really early in the spring when it's used up its stores and you start feeding it dry feed, if you do, maybe, but they brood up so fast, the weight of the hive goes back up again. So this is about as small as your hive's going to be if you're thinking about moving. And if you don't think in 10 frame deeps, like I don't, I immediately have to translate it to 3 10 frame westerns. If you're in 8 frames, it's going to take a little more than 2 deeps. If you're top bar, you're going to have to estimate this. If you have honey on the hives and you're still hesitating on whether to take it off or not, I really recommend that you have excess stores in the spring and harvest then. And you have that insurance. The bees watch the honey for you, and it's kind of neat to pull some honey off your hives in the spring. I do that. But then I stall on extracting. If you know me, you know I work very hard at not doing all the work of extracting. Even got somebody to do it this year for a percentage. That was really good. It's going to be difficult if you run it any closer than that. Then a deep's worth of bees of brood and a deep's worth of honey, 2 deeps total equivalent. If you run it any closer than that, you can run into trouble because more stores are used in a warm winter, and we can have really warm winters than in a cold. 2019 was the one that caught me unawares. It snowed and it froze. And I'm sorry. Okay. Anybody have a question? No. Okay. It caught me because I assumed my bees had enough stores. And one of my crazy hives out of 4, one of them decided that this was springtime. That was so much daylight. And they decided to brood up and they used every lick of stores they had. And when I finally realized that they were in trouble, it was too late. They had converted what was plenty of stores to make it through January, February, even into March. They used it all up raising brood at a time of the year when it wasn't realistic for them to even think they'd be able to go out and forage. If you are tempted to take honey, that's great. Just you got to feed it back as supplemental. And do not feel guilty about that. Honestly, the white table sugar that we feed to them, which is an excellent feed for them, is 50 cents a pound. And that honey, when you bottle it, could be $1.50 an ounce. And if you want to save that, freeze that honey, bank it, and it's the best spring feed. If you try to run it really closer than that one deep of stores and one deep of bees, individual colonies, like my 1 out of the 4, will do something wacky, raise more brood and use more stores. And your strain can change. You think you know what that hive did last year, but if it has a new queen, it may do something completely different the next winter. This also brings up the question of when beginning beekeepers are buying bees, they are told that certain strains are more winter hardy. Winter hardy may not be what you think it is when you're a beginner. It often means that some bees seem to recognize better when to cut back on population and stop using up stores to raise brood. They are more sensitive to changes in temperature. Some are more photosensitive. For example, that 1 in 4 hives that I had. And some people are buying like Carniolans, Caucasians, Russians, etc. If you were getting purebred, I think you might be able to say, yes, they know to not raise a lot of brood during winter and not use up all the stores before spring comes, but you're almost always buying a mutt. So discuss it with people before you pay extra money and buy something you think is winter hardy. It's a big buzz right now. People are talking about it all the time. It's kind of a trap for beginners. Also, if your bees are slow to brood up, because they are what is called winter hardy, you may in fact find that you get less honey production. And that is why the Italian, it's an Italian mutt, but I call them the Italifornians. They have a lot of Italian in their background that we get in our nukes and packages from down south. Why they actually are better honey producers, because they just brood up. You give them any kind of syrup in the spring and quite often they brood up no matter what the weather. Okay, is this the one I really want here? Okay, we talked about feed. I'm going to come back to feed. Moisture control is a big, big concern. Moisture control, it's not the moisture. Bees love high humidity. They like 50 to 80% to raise their brood, which if you think about it, you know that for the brood to be wet and white and glistening when you're looking at your larvae inside your beehive, it has to be pretty high humidity or they dry out. In the winter, they can go drier. That's okay. But in a lot of ways, they don't have an urge to. The problem is we are managing them in artificial circumstances, and we need to make sure that whatever moisture is in there does not condense and drip on them. We do this usually with ventilation. We do it with that insulation that I mentioned quickly between the outer telescoping cover and the inner cover. We often add a shim of some kind. I have a couple pictures of those to underneath that outer cover to absorb material. If condensation is absorbed, it can't drip down. We use something usually to hold that absorbent material up. It could be what's called a candy board or Vivaldi board. I use 1/8 inch screen, number 8 hardware cloth. Some people use burlap across the bottom of whatever they're using, whatever's containing the material, holding it up off the inner cover. Our top and bottom entrances, adjusting those, adjusting the sticky board, the slide out as needed. If you have a solid bottom board, the 1 inch lifting of the back of the hive to tilt it slightly, lowering the entrance and making sure that rain or moisture on the solid bottom board runs out, as well as I mentioned the condensation, if any formed, and you've lifted the back of the hive, any condensation forming on the inner and outer covers would roll down to the front and wouldn't drip directly on the bees that cluster. You're adding things and you're taking things off. Mouse guard, moisture shim, that feed, however you're going to feed them. Here's a picture of the burlap that I mentioned, stapled to the bottom. This is to hold up absorbent material for moisture control. You're taking off any excess, and you're definitely taking off queen excluders. Queens can't pass through a queen excluder. If the cluster moves up without them, they die. The cluster does what it does, but doesn't do it on direction from the queen. Even though the queen has the smarts to stay to the center of the cluster, they don't know that they need to stay where she is. She moves with them, not they moving with her. And in that ventilation, it's also important that you are protecting your hive from wind and weather. A carport's fine. Some people carport. A temporary shelter from the wind works. Wrapping is a little bit, I don't do it until things are definitely dropping in temperature. If you do it too early, it can make the bees think that winter hasn't come. And there's a certain amount of, we want them to drop in temperature. We want them to store surplus. We want them to form a cluster. And don't wrap too early. That's part of the controversy. If you hear people saying, don't do it, it causes troubles. Yes, it can if you do it too early. If you don't have a telescoping lid on, I recommend you switch from migratory to telescoping. Supplemental feed, I assume most people are already doing it 2-to-1. I say feed if you don't know if they need it, and feed until they stop taking it, unless you've gone inside the hive and you've seen that the queen has no room to lay and they have plenty of stores. That's called honey bound. Usually doesn't happen, but every once in a while it does. Liquid feed is the way bees really need to store. Granulated is emergency feed. It's not as good for them, not as easy for them to take. It doesn't really help insulate the hive. It can absorb some of that moisture we talked about if it's up there by the inner cover, where the warm, moist air of the hive could rise and could hit a cool surface. If instead there's granulated sugar there, it can absorb some of that. One of the reasons that dry feed, granulated, fondant, sugar bricks, blocks, are not good for bees is they can't eat it straight, just like we couldn't eat dry sugar straight. They also can't eat honey straight without diluting it with water. They actually need a certain amount of condensation on the walls or some part of their hive, or they have to go out and get water, which is very difficult for them to do when the temperature falls too low. I can't tell what's going to happen with the fall. I consider fall the hardest season because we just don't know if it's going to be warm, if it's going to be dry. Let's see, yesterday was Tuesday. We were over 70 degrees. That was not in my forecast. It was wonderful. We got in some hives. A friend got in, and I got together and worked on his hives and then my hives. Buddying up is the best way to go. But if the fall is unusually warm or dry, and we've had warm, sunny Octobers, you have to keep feeding. Even if you see pollen going in the hives at this time of year and you think, oh, they're getting lots of food. No, there's actually, for honeybees, they do collect a lot of pollen when they're raising a lot of brood, especially early in the spring. And they like fresh rather than even what they stored last year. If they can get fresh in the spring, they go out for it. But if bees have the option, they go for nectar before pollen. In July dearth, sometimes you will be seeing the bees bringing in pollen because that's all they can get. And they've used up almost all their nectar stores, their honey stores. At this time of the year, if the hive is still flying every day. We're 60s overcast. If there's not a good nectar source, they have to feed that entire hive, tens of thousands of bees, and they can use up what you fed them in early September or even late September if they fly all the way through October, which I have seen happen. So still feeding them as long as you can, liquid feed until they stop taking it is a good idea, in my opinion. Okay, we're not really talking now about winterization. I do recommend, and there's a little bit of research backing for it, that you feed continuously. You can feed till 55 degrees, definitely. We get to our temperature hovers there. We're at 60s daytime where I am right now, but it can go down to 50s. You can still be feeding liquid if the liquid is enclosed and covered. There's insulation on top of it. I have found it still works. And I like to allay people's fears about feeding white granulated sugar. How can that be good for the bees? We all know it's bad for people, right? Well, it's great for bees because it's really plant sugar. It's cane beet sugar in its purest form without anything that gives them bee diarrhea, the fecal spotting.
Hey, Eli,
Yes.
question on water in the winter. Do you provide any water to the bees to get to, because they can't go out for water, correct?
Right.
So how do you see where I've got my bees? What do you do for water for them?
Okay. On this side of the mountains, we usually don't worry about it for two reasons. It's often pretty rainy and they could get the water. The big reason, though, is really a little hard to understand. And it's kind of a journeyman level, but you sort of need to understand it. Moisture in a hive is not bad. Actually, condensation in a hive is not bad. That's actually where bees get their water to dilute the honey so that they can feed on it during the winter. They can't eat it straight any more than we could take a big spoonful of honey and try to swallow it. They can't do it either. I mean, you might get the first spoonful down, but it gets pretty dry pretty fast. They need to dilute it. They actually collect that from the walls, bottom, surfaces in the hive. And how do they have that much water? The same problem that we worry about when we worry about condensation dripping on them from the inner cover or the outer cover. They're getting it from the fact that when you take in carbohydrates and oxygen, you give off carbon dioxide, CO2, and H2O, water. They're constantly respiring. It's actually respiration for you biology type people. So they're giving off that moisture all the time. They actually recycle it. So moisture is not bad in the hive. Condensation actually isn't that bad. What's bad is condensation that drips on them. That's the bad part. So usually we don't worry about it. On the other, if you're on the east side of the mountains, if you happen to be there, or you're talking to people from drier areas, they can't count on that kind of moisture inside the hive because they have dry winters, dry cold as opposed to wet cold. So what bees do is a little bit of a mystery, and the water should be out there. I mean, if your bird baths or whatever you're using, your watering sources should still be out there, but they almost undoubtedly are going to get their own water inside the hive or on the rare days that they go out, but usually just from the condensation in the hive. I hope that explains it because it sounds really weird when I say it. Okay, with all the feeding, you have to be careful about robbing. As everybody's probably noticed, we've been through some of the worst robbing, and it's not just the yellow jackets. It's one hive is mysteriously doing really well next to the neighbor hive that just doesn't seem to be putting away that surplus feed. And what's happening is you've got bees sneaking in from the strong hive and robbing out the weak. And they can do it on a low level, or it can be a blatant, outright robbing shark frenzy type cloud of bees going crazy. We also know that it happens on a low level schedule, and we know that it happens year round. So robbing screens on in January, February is not crazy. I actually think that maybe we should just recommend doing it year round for hobbyists. It's not practical for commercial people. Liquid feeders, I assume people by now have found something that works. If you are top bar, it's going to be a little tricky. I have found this works on the Langstroth long that I've got with a hole drilled in one of the top bar wedges. Steve, you got to keep muting, okay? I just muted you again, unless you're going to ask a question, in which case you can ask a question. So this wrap round or rapid round, there's a couple of names for this. This type of feeder, it's got a hole in the center here, so it just needs an opening in the hive. It can sit on top of an inner cover, which has that oval opening, but its shallow profile fits under a lot of peaked roofs, especially for Langstroth longs, top bars, and such. It's one way to feed. A lot of these have different ways. Do try to outside the hive, please don't. It's just asking for trouble. And you think you don't have any bees within a mile. I'm sorry, you'll find out that you do, especially like in the spring, if your hive's a little weaker and that's a little stronger. I worry when my bees are bringing in too much nectar source too early in the year. And I worry that somebody else's hive is weaker. The solid food is actually emergency food, but do it for peace of mind if you want to. Just make sure that however you do it, you don't cover up your ventilation and you leave the bee space to get to it. Now, shims and spacers, I hope that's my next slide. Good, it is. An emery shim is a very shallow shim used often in honey production. But if you were to use that, going back, for example, here, the bees could come up between the frames, get to it, and then you could put the inner cover on top of that emery shim, and that would give them enough space to do that. This is too open. This is not a good plan for helping the bees control their moisture and their temperature in the hive. Quilt boards, spacers, candy boards are all kind of the same thing. This one is one that Man Lake did. This is a jar. This fits a gravity feed jar lid. And this is the one that would do, you could put the liquid feed here if you wanted to. You could take this lid out and they would have a hole that if this was sitting on top of your frames, you could put the granulated sugar here, sugar blocks, whatever you wanted, you could put it in here. Pollen patties, the bees take best if you put them under the inner cover. So if you were to flip this over upside down and use that space, the same way I was talking about using the emery inch space, you could get your solid feed in there or your pollen sub. Whatever feeder you use, remember, it's got to be accessible, something you can use that you're going to be able to monitor in December, January, in bad weather maybe, without chilling brood in late January, February. Internal is going to be easier for the bees to use. If it's liquid, it's going to, they can only use it so long anyway. External, you can see the level on, but can they utilize it? Whatever you do, keep those ventilation exits open. If your top bar, I hate to separate the bars of a top bar, but if you're going to do something hive top, you're going to have to somehow come up with a way that the bees can come up. On a top bar hive, though, using a Boardman feeder or a lot of other feeders on the floor of the top bar may work well enough if it's up close to the cluster. In late winter, early spring, you're going to be looking at increased humidity. That you may not need absorbency protection from condensation until then, but you might suddenly notice it in late December, January, going into February. Suddenly, the moisture levels might rise and you might see condensation on the lids instead of the sides, which is really not a problem for the bees. Oh, and your feeders. A lot of them need to have a ladder. Sometimes it's missing, but something that prevents the bees from drowning if it's an open top feeder. Enclosed to reduce the robbing risk. And then commercial will do things differently. We as hobbyists or small scale will end up doing things differently. You move to sideliner or commercial, you're going to use different strategies than what I'm talking about. Winterization goal. I wanted to check on how long I'm talking. I'll try to finish up as fast as I can because I'm talking longer than I really intend to. So your winterization goals, if you're thinking about the bees and your management of them, they've already done their part. You need to make sure there's enough bees that the cluster is large enough. Okay, that's part of your management. You might have to merge or small colonies or something. You need to make sure that there is space for the cluster to form. In one of the boxes, there is some space. They're not completely honey bound, which rarely happens, but I have seen it happen. In my experience, rarely happens. In your vertical Langstroth hive, you need to be able to let the cluster move upward as it tends to do. So you are going to start out your winter, if possible, with brood at the bottom and all the stores above them. So they move upward through the stores as they eat their way through the winter. On a top bar, this translates into they have to go sideways. And it's extremely important, even if you used a center entrance for your top bar, to make sure that they're going to be able to move in one direction only, unidirectionally, that the brood is on one side when they start the winter and they move and mix the brood with the honey, and then they're moving into their honey stores. If they end up with honey stores on both sides of the brood when you're working horizontally, it is possible for a sudden freeze to trap them on one side of the top bar with the brood that they cannot leave. Remember, workers cannot abandon brood. And the stores on the other side of an empty space in the middle of the top bar. So you don't ever want to end up with brood, empty space and honey. You want to make sure that the brood ended up where the stores are as the cluster traveled throughout the winter. We kind of looked at wind and rain protection, and you want to prevent that condensation. Not so much moisture and humidity, but condensation. And you've got to have access to your feeder. So large enough. And merging is a large part of that. Now, this is hard because when you merge two colonies, if you have two queens, it's not a problem if one is queenless so much. But if you have two queens, people have a hard time with this. So you can decide that you like one queen better and pinch the one you don't. You can, for a short period of time, maybe take one queen, a few frames of bees, and set them over in reserve until you make sure the other queen takes. But a lot of hobbyists just aren't comfortable making that decision, and they just let the two queens duke it out, and the best queen wins. And the way you merge colonies, the classic way, is the newspaper merge. And the Beekeeper's Handbook shows it. Here it is shown with a small hive here, which actually had a very good strong queen, and then newspaper through which the bees will chew their way gradually and combine with the hive you've placed up above. A colony on top and a colony below the newspaper. I like to also add a feeder on top. And one of the reasons that's really good to do if you aren't already doing it this time of year is that this set of bees is not going down here and looking like it's robbing. I think there's a better perception, and full stomachs make for happy bees and good relationships. I already talked quite a bit about the Varroa, so I think we'll pass on. You've got a large enough cluster. You've merged if you need to. You need to let the queen go with the cluster wherever it moves, so you've got to get that queen excluder off. Too many boxes and frames confuses the cluster. Move those out. On top bar, you're reducing the size of the hive by moving that sidewall, that follower board. Now, why did you have a lot of excess frames? Well, maybe you followed my advice, you over supered, you added made sure there were 2 frames, or actually added them every time you saw a frame of cat brood, to keep the bees from getting crowded, swarm prevention, maybe your bee's chimney. They just refuse to use the outside frames. 1 in 10 if it's a 10 frame, 1 in 8 if it's an 8 frame, and you need to take those extra frames out. And maybe you took off your honey supers, or you put them back on hoping they would fill them, and they didn't, so they're still empty. When they were making nectar, 2 frames of nectar actually shrink down to a frame of ripened honey. So at one point you had to have extra room just for them to do their work. The brood nest has gone down, the population has gone down. Okay. Now you've got a large enough cluster. You've got it organized. You're helping them out with not having too much space so they can form that cluster. And you're enabling them to move up with the brood to the bottom, the stores to the top. By this time, you're saying, wait a minute, I've got all these pieces. Where do I put them? What order do I put them in? Okay, I wrote it out. If you're holding your hive together with straps and weight, okay, that's on the top. So thinking top down here. And then you're going to have, is this my only hive? Oh, I think I redid this better. Yeah, I redid this better. You're going to have the straps, the weight. You're going to have your outer cover, your insulation, your moisture shim, maybe with a top vent or top vent, maybe a little top vent underneath it in the feeder shim, candy board, or inner cover, some small little vent. And you're going to logically put the moisture shim on top of any feed, on top of the inner cover, unless you've got like a little shim, like that emery shim, that really narrow one, and you've put your feed right on top of the frames, which is where bees prefer to have any pollen sun patties that you're using. Then you've got your deep worth of stores and deep worth of bees and brood. And then you've got your entrance with a mouse guard or robbing screen, whatever you're using, and your bottom board, screened or solid, whichever one you're using. So I'm trying to show you here on this list the top down of it. I talked about that. I'm sorry, things are a little out of order. Understanding that the cluster is going to maintain its temperature if you do everything you can to help them, and they've done what they're supposed to do. No matter what happens outside, the ambient, people use that a lot, ambient, the outside temperature. No matter what's happening there and how zingy it is, that cluster can do what it needs to do, maintaining its temperature.
Question for you.
Okay, yes?
In the winter, which I've never gone through since I'm a newbie, how often are you checking those hives? Because I think every time you pull the top off to check them or to change the feeder, you're letting cold in. So how often do you go out and check those in the wintertime?
That's a good question. It's how often? You should have an idea of how fast they're taking feed at this time of the year. You kind of watch and you know how often. Then in the winter time, it depends on how invasive your check is. If you've placed your feeder correctly, it should be a peak, and a peak doesn't even count as an inspection. If you're not moving the inner cover, right there, you're not letting a lot of heat out. If you're just checking the moisture absorbency, I'm guessing every week or two. Sometimes you can't get out there. You see something funny, you're going to come back in shorter order. Maybe other people could answer that question better. Maybe they've got an idea on that. It's just every week or two. Okay, I pretty much went through this, but it's a great diagram. I put the slide in because this is a great diagram of ventilation and bee space, and the air is moving 24/7 through the hive, and this is happening. And if you need to make an adjustment, it often will be a tiny adjustment. If you find there's too much moisture forming up here, you see your inner cover is wet, then even the tiniest of, people talk about matchsticks or popsicle craft sticks or thumbtacks, just raising just right here between the outer cover and inner cover, or between the moisture shim and the next level down, if you're trying to vent a little extra bout. And here's another diagram that I'm hoping sort of shows the whole concept of there's constant air moving. Here it actually is saying the warm air created by a cluster of bees rises. Okay, the cluster's on the bottom at the beginning. Fresh air is always coming into the hive and moving through. They're not trying to heat the whole hive. And what you're worried about is drips here. So you've got tilt, you've got moisture absorbency, ventilation. You can increase that slightly. It was an interesting one. And here again is the order in which things are stacked up, going up. Some people see it better this way. I wrote it in a list too. And here's where I wrote the stacking order better. A top to bottom stacking order. Basically, and then I tried to portray it, but when I put it all together, you couldn't really see. I took all this mess of pieces and put it together. I put, obviously, the bottom board with a slide out. This had actually a special type of slide out, a metal mouse guard, and then I had my 3 westerns, brood to the bottom, stores on top. Took that queen excluder out for good. Then I had my inner cover, with jar feeder on top. Then I had that enclosed with an empty hive box. My moisture absorbency was shredded paper. On top of that, I had 2-inch styrofoam. On top of that, a telescoping lid. That's what it looks like when I get all done. I was hoping this would help. And then if you wrap, I use Reflectix with a cam lock strap around it. And like I said, I don't do that until it gets really cold, until I know the bees have settled down and if hopefully those Californians have stopped raising the big family. Here's a hive carrier, which I'd be happy to lend anybody who's made that decision that their hive would be a better place. So kind of getting to the end here. Those 3 stages I mentioned, okay, you're getting through it. Again, you're reducing the number of boxes. You're getting that telescoping lid or peaked roof on. Top insulation, liquid feeder underneath that. Maybe you've got a strap or weighted lid on top of this. Honey is an insulator. That's why liquid feed is so important. And also they can access it better. Mouse guards, entrance reducers. A lot of this you are doing right now or already have done. And then if you haven't already, it's hitting that freezing point. Raise the back of the hive an inch. Insert the bottom, the slide out board, which I could still slide out anytime I want to check. Take the liquid feed out and I'm switching to the dry feed, the pollen sub, and the dry feeds in the shim, either replacing the inner cover or right on or right under the inner cover. Then above that, I've got my moisture or quilt box. Moisture boxes, quilt boxes, people are using the same different terms to refer to the same concept of controlling condensation. And top vent. Okay, and the last stage is that wrap and getting down to that smallest entrance opening or robbing screen and such. And then you're going to monitor. And I think that's the end pretty much of my slides talking about winterization, running through it. We actually take longer. It's a little more in depth, as I said, like when you get to journeyman. Oh, the one other thing is this awful wax moth. Wax moth, once it gets into your stores, it is a pain. It eats up your drawn comb. That is, you've earned it. Even if you have a total dead out, you have not failed. If you get some honey out of it, you get some drawn comb, and you've got your equipment organized for next year. But you've got to keep those wax moths from eating up your drawn comb. Freezing the frames, that kills wax moth in their eggs. And if you bag it right away, either before or after, right before or right after you put it in the freezer, then that keeps another wax moth from getting in there and laying eggs. There's a chemical that works to kill wax moth? PDB, paradichlorobenzene. I like a bug zapper, plus hanging things. There's frames hanging with air circulation and light. It's hard to get enough light without putting your frames right in a window. So the bug zapper on a timer just needs to go on for like an hour a day, and it makes a big difference. And that's really the most of what I had to say. Don't wait too long. Start in August. Don't try to overwinter a weak hive. And really, people have more trouble with the condensation and the starvation than cold because the bees can handle the cold. Part of it's people get really confused by our mild winters. We don't follow the rules for the rest of the United States. I'm not the only beekeeper who's been around for a while who says we need a book about how to keep bees in Western Washington in a different climate, which is much more like the UK, British Columbia, even the Great Lakes region. It's even more like that than most of the United States. So most of the United States advice tends to confuse us. I do recommend that you pick up and seal your dead outs. I would pick them up, take the honey, take your drawn comb and store it safe from wax moths. You have not failed if you lose your hives the first winter, because you still have drawn comb, probably some honey, experience, and a lot of your equipment. You already have it on hand. It's a head start for the next year. Look at it that way, okay? Positive attitude. Okay, Jenty asks, can you feed liquid sugar water throughout the winter in a frame feeder? If it's a really, really mild winter, maybe, but it would have to be, and we have them really, really mild. It's not recommended, partly because people say it's too much moisture for them to handle. I'm not sure if that's so much the case as in when they go into cluster, it's not easy for them to move and get to it. A really, really mild winter, it might be possible. I've never tried. Anyone else have an idea on that? I've tried it. And I should stop the recording right now because otherwise the recording runs too long. Okay, stopping the recording.